Performance Improvement Manager for Northern Trains Limited. I am fairly unique. Northern are the only train operating company in the UK with a seasonal performance improvement manager. We do have colleagues at Network Rail, seasonal delivery managers and seasonal delivery specialists, and indeed my role was created originally in 2015 to improve cooperation with colleagues at Network Rail. And I've been doing that job for 9 years, and prior to that was 16 years with Network Rail. Quite a lot of that time was involved with, particularly around autumn performance, railway treatment trains and vegetation management. So I'll start. First attempt to move the slides on has failed. Let's try. There we go. So just to give today a bit of context, we've actually got 3 parts of the Northern network that we can't actually run on at the moment due to the weather conditions. Baildon, which is between Bradford, Foster Square and Ilkley, was blocked on the 7th of February by a landslip. There's also it's an unstable cutting with some houses at the top, and the houses have actually had to be evacuated. Baildon has quite a lot of school traffic, so there's a lot of people having to probably sort out shuttling the kids to school at the moment for a number of weeks. It is due to reopen again in April. We've also got Workington, Bridge 37, which is a Derwent viaduct. That closed to all rail traffic on the 29th of February due to scour affecting the piers. Again, we're looking at reopening in April, but at the moment we can't run from Workington to Carlisle. So we're running up the Cumbrian coast as far as Workington, and then we're running a shuttle from Carlisle to Maryport. But that route's actually is broken at Workington. And finally, we've also got the line block between Pontefract, Tanshelf and Nottingley due to a landslip. And again, probably looking at April before that's reinstated. So climate change, we've been talking about it for years, and it's always been over the horizon, but it now looks as if we're starting to see gradual changes in conditions. We're seeing warmer, wetter winters and drier, hotter summers. Last autumn was 1 degree above the average temperature for the period between 1999 and 2020. So it's this incremental increase, and obviously we saw in 2022 the 2 hot spells. See more intense rainfall, which leads to flooding, and ultimately we'll see higher mean sea levels, which influences tides and surges and depth limited waves. It's particularly concern for us, again, going back to the Cumbrian coast. There's part of the Cumbrian coast route that are literally on the sea, protect the cliffs from the sea effectively, a bit like Dawlish. So yeah, it's going to be quite a challenging future for these routes. Less confidence, although again we've certainly seen it in terms of named storms this year. But yeah, we'll see more high winds and heavy rain events. This is some Network Rail figures from the period 2008 to 2019, showing the delay minutes for different types of weather event. Winds the highest, flooding is the darker blue, which is the second highest. Substantial amount of delay minutes. Autumn's actually the third one, which we're not going to touch on today, because we know about autumn, it happens every year. And then the lighter grey are snow events, and those 4 are head and shoulders above the rest. Interesting, the red one for hot weather, for heat, is fairly low at the moment, but that was, like I say, it's 2029. Would expect to see that column increase over time in the future. Just quickly go through the weather forecasting. So weather forecasting has improved due to advances in computing technology. Predictability of weather forecasting has been improved by about a day a decade since the middle of the 20th century. And currently forecasts over a week ahead are reasonably accurate. Going forward, is forecasting up to a month in advance going to be feasible? We'll have to see, but it's an important adaptation for climate change. However, when the forecasts aren't completely infallible, we had an instance in December at Ulverston, South Lakes, on the 2nd of December 2023, where two bands of snowy weather converged over the Irish Sea. This resulted in a slow-moving weather front that dumped in excess of 20 centimetres of snow across South Cumbria. The original forecast had been for 2 to 5 centimetres on the previous day. The Met Office declared an amber weather warning at late morning, just before midday. But it was significant disruption. Power was lost to 7,000 homes. 200 cars were trapped overnight. We had a train, one Charlie 62, which was the second to last train from Lancaster to Barrow-in-Furness. Finished up getting stranded at Ulverston by trees that were brought down by the snow, both in advance of the train, and then when it tried to return back towards Lancaster, found that trees had fallen behind it as well. There were 70 passengers on board. We were stranded on the train for several hours. It was difficult to access the train because the road network was also shut. However, the Network Rail 4x4 did manage to make it to the site in the early hours of the morning. The Network Rail guys had bought out the entire stock of the petrol stations, snacks and drinks to take to the train, and then they ran a shuttle with the 4x4 to Barrow to take 35 people home. What happened to the other 35? I guess they walked. It's about 10 miles. There was another station, Dalston, between Ulverston and Barrow, so maybe some of them were for that station, which was a bit closer. There's a picture taken from the front of the train. You can see the rails are fairly unaffected, but it wasn't just that tree, it was several trees. The Network Rail mobile operations manager that attended tried to actually work through and cut some down, but there were just too many in the end, and they gave up. So looking at weather forecasting, and we use a service that Network Rail have contracted with MetDesk, a company called MetDesk, to provide. So we get a range of forecasts. The 5-day regional is the one we use predominantly. You get a 10-day national forecast. We've also got hourly forecasts, adhesion forecasts in autumn. The conductor rail doesn't really apply to northern. That's from Merseyrail and south of the Thames, where you're worried about ice forming on conductor rails. Hot rail forecasts. So this is particularly for critical rail temperatures, which we'll come to later. The fire hazard, we use that to stop running steam charters on particularly hot days as they cause fires. OLE, overhead line icing risk. And then there's coastal forecast, lightning risk. The freight wind forecast, we have had containers blown off freight wagons on the highest points in Cumbria in the past, which is why we have a freight wind forecast as well. This is a typical 5-day forecast for Cumbria. I lifted this from between Christmas and New Year, and you can see the different colours. So Cumbria, we had heavy rain on the Saturday, was an extreme warning. There was adverse for wind on the Friday and adverse for frost on the Tuesday. And you can see the temperatures. So green is normal, aware is starting to become a little more concerning, but adverse and extreme are the two warnings that we tend to trigger extreme weather action team phone conferences, which are an industry conference led by Network Rail. These are the trigger thresholds for the different colours for different types of weather. So we're starting with wind speeds and then rainfall, heat, cold, snow. So that's basically what drives those forecasts. So the extreme weather action team teleconferences led by Network Rail route controls. Some routes, one of the routes we work with has a separate internal and external EWAP, whereas the other one actually combine it together. The reasons, I can see reasons for both, and I'm quite comfortable with both, with either method. They're attended by asset managers, Network Rail maintenance, Network Rail operations, and the train and representatives of the train and freight operating companies. So as part of this process, we decide, looking at the weather forecast, do we need any line of route restrictions or any blanket emergency speed restrictions? Are there any requirements to run locomotives down a route prior to the first train to prove it, to make sure it's not blocked? Ahead of particularly heavy rainfall, go out checking trash screens and culverts for any blockages. Are there any additional resources required? Do we need chainsaw gangs if it's going to be windy, or additional mobile operations managers? And is any customer messaging required? So if we agree this through the EWAP process, we should be getting consistent messaging out across the industry. So moving on to hot weather now. Historically, the UK network was designed to operate up to 35 degrees air temperature. The hot weather events we saw in July and August 2022 were significantly higher. It's interesting talking to the Met Desk forecasters. They said usually we expect hot weather records to be broken by point something of a degree, whereas in 2022 we were 3 and 4 degrees higher than the previous highest temperatures. Due to a lack of knowledge about how the infrastructure would cope in these temperatures, a number of restrictions were imposed on the network, notably blocking the East Coast main line between York and King's Cross for about 12 hours. But since 2022, there's been significant work carried out to get a better understanding of what the infrastructure can cope with, and key route strategies have been developed out of those. So the KRS sets out a service that we can operate within the limits of the infrastructure, the ability to staff key junctions, and to be able to respond to any incidents. What we don't want is to run a full service and then finish up with a big incident occurring and trains stood in very hot weather. The key air temperature for triggering KRS is now 41 degrees. Bear in mind the highest recorded temperature read in 2022 was 40.3 at Cummings in Lincolnshire. So well, I'm touching wood. Hopefully we won't be seeing those temperatures for a few more years, maybe. Certainly not in the north of England. There are some measures that may be implemented at 38 degrees on the northwest. We're looking at a differential speed of 45 over 90, 45 for freight, 90 for passenger on electric traction. There are other locations that may be at higher risk with critical rail temperatures, which we'll come to later, and where the OLE has no tensioning system, which for us is the Hadfield line, just southeast of Manchester, which I'll come to now. So the Hadfield line, for those that aren't familiar with it, it was originally a route that went across to Sheffield from Manchester through the Woodhead tunnel, and it was electrified in the late 40s, and the original electrification was 1500 volts DC. After the closure of the route to Sheffield in the 80s, the remaining route to Hadfield and Glossop was converted to 25,000 volts AC, with using the same basic OLE equipment. Now, due to the original voltage being DC, it would be 1500 volts DC. Clearances, potentials a lot lower than 25,000 kVA. So obviously clearances were a lot less than is required for 25,000 volts AC. So we've got quite a few substandard clearances on the route. And as I said, there's no tensioning equipment to maintain the correct tension in the OLE as it expands and contracts. I just threw that in for interest. That's the original Woodhead promotional materials found on the internet. So basically, in hot weather, the OLE expands, and with no tensioning, it sags. At 35 degrees now, as part of the KRS, Northern have to substitute diesel traction for electric traction on the route, which can be quite a challenge. We're not over endowed in diesels. There aren't diesel units to simply transfer over, so it probably means short forming or cancelling another route. We have previously there's a particularly tight spot under Bridge 10 at Gorton. So up until 2020, early 2023, we actually had to swap the traction over at 26 degrees. And then we actually finished up blocking the line when the OLE sagged so much it was bouncing off the unit roof as they were passing under it. Now we've solved that problem now by they've carried out 100mm track lower at that location, which is why we can now operate up to 35 degrees. So just excuse me a minute. Yeah. Right. Sorry about that. So possible solution. I saw this in an article just over a year or so ago. This is the Great Eastern route from Liverpool Street to Chelmsford. You look at the second paragraph of the article. If you remove the references to the East and Chelmsford, it's almost an identical problem statement for the Hadfield line. So this has been basically solved over a 15-year period. So they have installed a tensioning system, and they now don't have the problems at the lower temperatures. So maybe in the future we'll sort out the Hadfield line. There are some questions still outstanding about key route strategies. Given the regional temperature variance across Britain, where would KRS be applied if triggered? For example, if it was 41 degrees at King's Cross, would we implement KRS across the whole of the eastern region, even though probably West Yorkshire, Humberside and the North East would be 2 or 3 degrees cooler? One thing we do struggle with, the industry as a whole cannot cope with short-term timetable changes. Timetables are planned years in advance. You're matching the fleet availability with train crew. They're quite complex. Sometimes we use other train operators' trains to move our train crew around. So if we suddenly start taking trains out in hot weather, it can get things like the pass rides may not exist. There's also a question about whether if we do thin out the service on hot weather and we say don't travel or expect disruption, will passengers heed any of that messaging? And will certain routes to coastal locations such as Blackpool, Bridlington and Saltburn, that are particularly popular for us, suffer overcrowding? It's interesting, at the National Autumn Review in February 2023, so I'm just trying to remember what year it was, just over a year ago, the keynote speech was given by the MD of Southeastern, and he recalled an instance where they'd been expecting high winds and put out do not travel messaging, and it didn't stop people coming in to travel into London on the morning. In the afternoon, the winds brought lots of trees down and blocked most of the routes, and 60,000 people were stuck at the terminal stations in London. So it is a challenge to balance that. We don't want to have overcrowded trains on a really hot day. Also, will there be any government guidance? And also with schools, if it's in term time, would there be any consistent approach to school opening? We'll try to find out the answer to that, but my gut feeling is probably no to both. So yeah, moving on to critical rail temperatures. So these are locations that haven't been stressed, or where there's insufficient resistance to buckling, or where the track's been disturbed, or possibly a track renewal site. These are all included on a critical rail temperature register, which is distributed quite widely, including to train operators every week from the 1st of April to the 30th of September. There's 3 levels depending on the temperature. So the first trigger temperature is a watchman. Then you have a 30/60 differential speed. But the one that usually has a performance impact is the 20 mile an hour blanket ESR over that particular section. And in July 2022, we had a 20 mile an hour CRT imposed between Hull and Scarborough, a distance of 53 miles, which actually made it impossible to operate the train service. Pleased to say that situation's now improved. So hopefully if it does get hot this summer, we will be able to operate on that route, because that is as you'd expect on a hot day to places like Bridlington. It is quite a popular route. We also had an incident last year with a CRT where it was imposed over an existing emergency speed restriction site. So the original ESR was 40 miles an hour. It's been in place for a few days, sorry. And then the CRT was imposed over it, and the boards were changed from 40 to 20. But a couple of drivers had been driving past it all, for that period, hadn't noticed that the reduced speed, and we had a couple of overspeeding incidents. So it's something we just need to be careful of. So train operator measures, we have quite a big process for getting the fleet ready that starts in February each year, making sure the aircon's working where we have aircon, and the cooling systems are working as well as they can do. The legacy fleet, so these are the kind of mid-1980s vintage Class 150s, 155s, 156s. They tend to have a maximum operating air temperature of 38 degrees and aren't air conditioned. We do see incidents basically where the engine overheats, and it's called return to idle, so it just cuts out, particularly where trains are working on a gradient on a hot day. Generally you find you let it stand for a bit and it can then take off again. We also have dandelion season for about 2 to 3 weeks in May every year. So this is when we get loads of airborne seeds that jam up radiators and again cause return to idle incidents if they're not tackled. So all the way through dandelion season, there's a lot of activity overnight to make sure radiator grills are either manually brushed or jet washed. If we have any kind of stranded train incident in hot weather, basically the decision on evacuating a train is brought forward to 30 minutes. And we also keep bottled water on both network rails and northern response vehicles. And at stations, we have crowd control measures organised. We've installed 54 water fountains at 54 of our busiest stations, because there's multiple ones on the bigger ones, which allow passengers to fill up bottles with cold water. Network Rail have done the same at their major stations, and other such Aventi have also installed them. So there's plenty of water available on stations. We also have bottled water on hand at key hubs. We do have to consider staff exposure to hot weather, so trying to limit the amount of time people spend out in the open. Bring portable air conditioners into mess rooms and offices. We usually get loads of ice pops and put them in the freezers as well. We have ill passenger policies, which are particularly pertinent given the ambulance response times. So if a passenger's taken ill, sometimes the advice would be to keep on going to a station where you're more likely to get an ambulance. And in times of hot weather, it's more important still, given that the heightened risk that passengers may be taken ill, that these policies are worked as quick as possible. One of the challenges from 2022 has got a lot of complaints about the temperatures on even the new air-conditioned fleet. And part of the problem we've identified is that train sits at a terminal station awaiting its next duty. The doors are often open, and it's effectively air conditioning in the local environment rather than the train itself. So I'm not keen on kind of locking trains out and leaving people melting on the platform, but we need to see maybe if we can reduce the time that the doors shut automatically, just to give the train air conditioning chance to work. Moving on to convective rainfall, this is another summer issue. So these are the very intense spells of rain that we get in the summer, which are very difficult to predict on when and where and how severe they'll be. It caused derailment at Watford Tunnel in 2016. Basically, huge downpour and water got channeled. The ground was fairly hard. Water got channeled down a cutting at the side of Watford Tunnel and caused a landslip, which a train ran into. Fortunately, it stayed virtually upright, because when a train passed in the other direction, they did touch, but not as bad as if it had fallen on its side. Network Rail recently introduced a convective alert tool, and this uses a rainfall radar to trigger alerts in real time if certain thresholds are breached, and basically a 40-mile-an-hour emergency speed restriction can be imposed over a limited geographical area for a relatively short period of time. This is done using the GSMR radio that allows signallers to communicate with drivers. It was introduced about 10 or 15 years ago. We'd previously had to impose blanket emergency speed restrictions over a much wider area and across a longer time period. So this has been a big improvement on being able to operate in convective rainfall. Just looking at flooding in general, it's covered by Module M3 of the rulebook. Drivers must report and stop any flooding to the signaller, but there are different levels. So up to the bottom of the railhead would work normally. At the top of the railhead, you're looking at a 5-mile-an-hour speed restriction, and then if it's above the railhead, movements are only permitted by the instruction of the control. That's fine as long as the water's standing. If the flood water's moving and there's a risk that ballast is being dislodged, then trains cannot operate over the flooding, and we have to wait for an engineer to attend. So flooding can cause significant disruption to passenger services. It's an increasing problem for maintaining rail services. There is a long-standing legal right, though, so you've got a right to natural drainage. So this means that water flowing naturally across the surface of land is permitted to flow naturally into a neighbour's land, but you must not change that flow of water so as to cause damage to your neighbour's land. So we see this quite a lot with some of the developments that take place alongside the railway. Oh, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself now. So these are some performance figures for Northern for flooding over the last 2008 to 2022. Again, we see big variances in the impact each year. 2019 obviously was particularly bad. The orangey line is the primary delay, so these are the minutes that are directly the result of the flooding. The blue line is reactionary delay, so this is the kind of network delay. The knock-on effect of a late running train. So if, say, one of our trains is delayed coming into Leeds by a flood, it then delays an LNER train going to London, which then impacts on a Thameslink train north of King's Cross that can actually export that delay to Brighton. Or the flip side is we delay something going up towards Scotland. So the reactionary delays can be exported to all points of the country from a single incident. The grey line at the bottom is the cancellations. So yeah, beyond the boundary, particularly one particular instance that caused quite a lot of disruption between 2020 and 2022, where there was a housing estate. They managed to tie their drainage into the track drainage, and the track flooded. I believe it went to court in the end to get it sorted out, but fortunately it is no longer a problem. But Network Rail's asset protection departments have the task of monitoring developments to try and weed out some of these issues before, or while they're still at the planning stage and before they get built. It's worth mentioning an issue we had at St Helens, where housing development was built without planning permission and without consent, drainage consent, and we finished up with sewage in the track drainage, which was particularly unpleasant. I could talk all day about flooding sites, but I won't. I'll just pick a couple of favourites. This is Rotherham Central. As you can see from the map on the left, the station's right next to the Rotherham Canal, and then on the right you've got the River Don. What we were finding was when the River Don, the river level rose on the River Don, water poured into the canal and then flooded the railway. What we were doing was there was actually monitoring of the river level. So we'd stop train running 6 hours before it actually flooded, and this gave Network Rail time to actually get in and remove the signalling equipment so it didn't get damaged in the flooding. but it also meant we needed 6 hours at the end of the flooding event to put it all back again before we could start running again. This route we also share with Sheffield Supertram. It's the first tram train route in the UK, so they get badly disrupted as well. Hopefully we're going to get this under control. Network Rail have completed flood prevention works along all the boundary at Rotherham Central, and they've also contributed 400,000 towards the construction of this canal barrier that you can see in the photograph that prevents floodwater from the river entering into the canal. That was completed last year. There's also a wider flood defence scheme that Network Rail have been asked to contribute towards, but I believe discussions are still ongoing with that, so that might take a bit longer to sort out. The second one just wanted to look at is Bridge 96 at Walsden. This is on the Calder Valley route between Victoria and Bradford and Leeds, and it's Northern's principal route over the Pennines. As you guess from the name, it runs through a steep valley. Bridge 96 is a flat steel deck over a stream which rises very quickly towards the underside of the structure. And when it does, the route requires to be closed. There's very few options to improve the situation without massive cost. So basically raising the height of the embankments and the bridge, which aren't really feasible. We've now got CCTV that monitors the river levels, so we can actually stop trains setting off from Leeds and Manchester in advance of the river level being breached, which does make it easier having to return them wrong line if they do get there and find it is blocked. Now there is a wider scheme to actually reopen a reservoir, which the Transpennine route upgrade have contributed towards. There's still a bit of a funding shortfall, but part of the research for this, I discovered an article in the Halifax Courier in December that suggested that funding shortfall had now been resolved. So hopefully we can look forward to that Walsden becoming a thing of the past as well. Moving on to high winds, very unpredictable, difficult to manage. The damage it causes can be random. It's usually fallen trees, but we've had garden sheds and trampolines on the track. We should clean the board in the Olympics in trampolining. If you take any journey in an urban area by train, you see thousands of them in gardens. But yeah, this is the Network Rail vegetation standard that was updated in 2018 to address the risk of fallen trees. So you can see you've got the red immediate action area where you have to take all vegetation out, and then there's a 45-degree line in the action zone to the boundary, and basically that takes out all the taller trees that would be in danger of falling across the track or the overhead line. Obviously, to achieve that compliance is absolutely massive given the state of vegetation on the line side at the moment. So they have taken a derogation out against it for a few years to try and achieve that compliance. Oops. It's not just Network Rail line side trees though. You can have trees that fall from outside the boundary. You might have seen this in the media in December in Scotland, Bridge of Orkney, where a tree came down across the tracks and got hit by that train. Driver was uninjured, but you can see how he was lucky to get out of that. Moving on to snow and ice. So Northern operate over 460 stations. We employ contractors to carry out platform de-icing. So they get an individual forecast every day at midday for every station. If that forecast is 0.5 degrees C or below, they'll send out a team to put a product called Procoat, which is evaporated seawater, which is salt produced from evaporated seawater, which has got a corrosion inhibitor added. So that's applied to the platform. Basically, they start treating late afternoon, running such a big network. Obviously, there's more than one gang, but it runs through the night and into the next morning. We do have certain locations where we approve particularly problematic, like Burnley, Manchester roads, stands out in my mind. We actually treat them twice, once in the evening and once in the morning, to prevent it refreezing. If it's a forecast of -4 or below, we try and run up diesel units for various periods of time during the night to stop them freezing up. It is quite tricky from a resourcing point of view, because we don't have drivers who are booked to work complete nights. We have people that work very late and others that book on very early. So it's about getting those people to run them up. Electric trains ideally need the pan up and the heating on, but that's not always feasible. If there's possessions and isolations, it's interesting. We used to, when we only had 17 in the northwest, we used to try and put them all in the shed, under the shed at Piccadilly, undercover, but that's no longer feasible. We've got probably 100 electric trains now. In terms of infrastructure, so we have issues with mechanical points and signalling particularly in the Peak District, frozen points in Buxton. There's a lot of point seating now, which is really helpful, and a lot of it's got intelligent infrastructure. So this is like remote condition monitoring that warns of any issues with the equipment, so it can be attended to before it fails. We've also got ice in tunnel shafts. The pictures from an incident in 2010 when ice was allowed to build up in an air vent and it dropped onto the track, and then a TP unit ran into it. It was interesting at the time. We were involved with the debate about how you inspect tunnels safely when there's this risk, and somebody suggested using drones, and we all laughed because drones in 2010 were little more than toys. But looking now, maybe that's a useful application. Snow, again, the rulebook is basically 8 inches of snow above the railhead before you stop running trains. That's fine on plain line. A bit more challenging with points. At that depth, the point seaters will be overwhelmed, and it's going to be quite challenging for people to manually clear snow from points. Last major event was the Beast from the East in February, or the Beasts, sorry, February, March 2018. We did cope quite well for the first couple of days, but as the road network declined, it became more of a challenge. Obviously, Network Rail people couldn't get to locations where there were issues. Train crews couldn't get into work if they're working on an earlier or late train. We used a lot of taxis to shuttle train crews between train crew depots and train depots, which were problematic in the ice. So we were looking at running train shuttles between places like Leeds and Neville Hill, Victoria and Newton Heath. Engineering struggled to defrost sufficient trains to operate the service. There is a question that, are we too dependent on road transport? 50, 60 years ago, that there wouldn't have been anywhere near as much road transport used to support the railway. Perhaps there's some lessons we can learn from the past. So the new Northern Fleet, you might have seen quite a lot of publicity last summer. We've begun a procurement process for up to 450 new multiple units, which will be a mix of electric, diesel that will be potentially that can be switched to battery or electric in the future, or battery electric hybrids. This new fleet's been specified to operate at an air temperature up to 45 degrees C. They'll have air conditioning throughout the saloons and the cabs. They'll also have a heated coupler, heated light covers, and heated internal water systems to prevent freezing. So they should be a bit more resilient for hot weather. So, last slide. Do we struggle on in weather events or shut the network? The industry does say it has an aspiration to be seasonally agnostic, but this can only be achieved with more resilient infrastructure. We've seen parts of the network shut down in the UK ahead of weather events in recent months. To me, it seems a bit defeatist. And also, what happens if you do shut down ahead of a weather event that doesn't actually materialise? We saw this in Anglia a few years ago, where snow was forecast and the service was cut by 50%, and do not travel messages were put out, and then the snow never materialised on the day, and there was quite a lot of stakeholder discontent. Or even what if, we talked about Ulverston, where it was worse than forecast, but what if it isn't? And that again goes back to the question of better forecasting, I guess. But polls of the public have indicated a belief that rail is the most reliable mode of transport in extreme weather. And are we in danger of losing that trust? I'll just finish off by just asking if anybody has read Stephen Barber's message from the Chief Executive Officer in the PWI Journal in October 2023, where he made some interesting comments about how we cope with the hot weather in 2022 and his experiences of travelling around France and Spain last summer in temperatures in excess of 40 degrees, and everything seemed to be working normal. So it does question whether there's some lessons to be learnt from our friends on the continent. So that's my presentation. Took a little bit longer to get through than planned, but if anybody's got any questions, please feel free.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks for, I think you've covered quite a lot of ground today. I'll as ever sneak in a couple of questions whilst people are thinking of them. Bridge 96, what is the solution there?
So the idea is it's not a railway scheme. It's basically a scheme to protect the village as well from flooding. But there's a reservoir up in the hills that was deactivated in the late 90s, which I think was possibly a short-sighted decision, which they're now looking to reactivate. And basically, water, when you get heavy rainfall, the water would collect in the reservoir, and rather than running in as much quantity down the hillside and into the streams.
Fine. Well, okay, fantastic. Ulverston, how long were the people on the trains at the Ulverston incident in the snow?
It's 5 or 6 hours. It was a train that left Lancaster just after 9. It got stuck about 10 well, it's about an hour to Barrow, isn't it? So it must have been about 10 o'clock. According to log, the Network Rail mobile operations manager, and the ops manager got there about 2:30 in the morning. But by the time they've shuttled 35 people back to Barrow, or to Barrow and back in a 4x4, some of them would have been on for most of the night. The train crew were there until the morning.
And the last one for me, come on, there must be some questions for people on the call. Legacy vehicles, with all these new vehicles coming in, are you going to get rid of the legacy ones, and when will that happen?
That's the plan. It's a difficult one.
You don't know.
I think I've seen 2028. In fact, I'm trying to think, with 2026, I know it was an even number. Is 2026 feasible, or now 24? No, I think we'd struggle. I think it must have been 2028 I saw, through to about 2030. But as we've seen with other new fleets of trains, the introduction often moves to the right of the programme. And the various issues with driver training and software problems mean they get delayed.
Okay, thank you. Go on, there must be some question from colleagues on the call, ex-route engineers or designers. Rob, sorry.
Yeah, well, I've just put one in, Dave. So I'll just read it out. I'll just read it out if you like. So yeah, just usually, just as a person, regular member of the public, you see these red amber sort of Met Office weather warnings. Do they directly influence what's happening in terms of railway responses?
No, because we tend to use the Met Desk warnings. We do use them, we're aware of them happening, but usually, if there's a Met Desk, there's a Met Office. Too many companies with Met in the name. If there's a Met Office warning of a particular event, we've probably got a Met Desk one to match it.
Okay, there's one from Barry Kelly in the call, in hot weather operations. You see that?
Hang on, I'll have to come out of slideshow.
Right. I've struggled with members of the public deciding to self-detrain, and what steps do Northern take to manage the public's actions during extreme events?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. We had an issue with somebody self-evacuating. I mean, basically, and you might remember 2 or 3 years ago there was a big one in the southeast where a train got stuck with a frozen conductor rail, and lots of people self-evacuated and were wandering around a bit of railway with lots of live third rail on it, which could have been quite challenging. But yeah, we basically try and keep the train crew and subsequently the passengers as informed about what's happening as possible. So that the conductors are advised to initially try and do an update every 2 minutes, but clearly that's not practical over a couple of hours, or even longer. And I'm just trying to remember. I almost got it there. We had an incident, Deansgate, I think it was. It wasn't a weather-related incident, but we did have some people self-evacuating, and this is the problem: just trying to get sufficient information to people, and also just trying to get the incident resolved. Sometimes I remember it now. It's finally arrived. Just before Christmas, there was a tree caught fire. It fell over against the overheads between Piccadilly and Oxford Road, caused a massive amount of disruption. That was when we had the self-evacuation. But yeah, so it's just trying to keep people informed. What we've done post the Ulverston incident, working with Network Rail, is the response vehicles in winter will now carry those foil blankets, water, and energy bars, just so that if we can get to people, we can at least keep them replenished. But yeah, it's about A, keeping people informed, and B, trying to resolve the incident as soon as possible. And it is frustrating sometimes that some of the incidents seem to take an inordinate amount of time to clear. It's something as an industry I think we need to get better at.
Okay, thank you. I think that Daniel Gibbs put a question in there. Where do all the emergency gangs come from? Are emergency personnel pulled from other railway operations, and are they put on alert with a few days' notice to help with mobilisation?
Yeah, I mean, basically, Network Rail maintenance, it'll be the OLE gangs, the track guys, potentially pulled off the day-to-day stuff they're doing. One of the issues you have is if you've got what looks like an extended event, is you don't throw everybody into it in the first 12 hours and find you've got nobody in reserve. So yes, sometimes it's got to be a little bit of a balance to make sure you've got that resource for the entire period of the weather event.
Okay. Well, just bearing in mind time, we'll probably bring the meeting to an end. Rob, thanks again for presenting. You covered a lot of range of things, and at least give us something to think about the challenges that we've got coming forward. So we do a round of applause virtually, I guess. So thank you for that. And then just to remind people, the next presentation is on Metrolink on the 18th of April. It's going to be a little bit early at 12:30. It'll be a hybrid meeting. If you want to attend at TFGM's offices, you'll have to book a spot, if I can say it. But obviously there will be online facilities that works as well. But thanks again for attending today, and take care. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No problem. Cheers, Paul.
All right, cheers. Bye-bye. Thanks, Rob.
No problem.
Thanks, Dave. Bye.
Right.
Okay, Rob. Thanks
Looks like
a lot.
everybody's gone. Right. See ya.
Great. Take care.